function inside Bloomberg. If you do Bloomberg peers, it's a field, and the bit that everybody likes is you click it. Wait, how do I get rid of it? Left.
And
there you are. So,
all right.
all good.
Да ладно, не надо, не так видно.
Занятие цветного экрана, чтобы мы на этом экране снимали запись.
Okay. Well, it was just, the idea is just you can see it dragging and dropping. It's not a big important point.
So, and just the last question, how often, just your feeling, how often do peers are changing?
So, there's like a once a year review process.
Once a year review? And
because we review our classification system once every year, because Bloomberg's classification, BICS, is just determined that way.
Yeah. And actually, the list is not changing much as far as I know.
Companies don't change their business lines that often.
All right,
So
thank you very much.
if they did, like if you had a company that became, like it moved from being consumer apparel to luxury goods, then you would probably change.
All right.
So it's that sort of thing.
Okay.
So, with that in mind, we could break down by the different types of revenue source, which is a good way because it means you're using apples with apples, oranges with oranges, as is the often used phrase. And how do you compare? Well, I wouldn't use this first screen ever to look at how they're doing because it's just telling you like prices and not much else. If you wanted to come up with a valuation, a fair valuation of where the company is, Comp Sheets does a really good job because it will give you all of the different things to value that business. And these are all the multiples that are relevant to the industry. When we say multiples, we're talking about enterprise value or price divided by some item on the income statement. So the difference between the two would be if you use price, you're really only valuing the equity. If you use enterprise value, you're valuing the debt as well. Okay? So it's quite an important distinction. Similar to before when I mentioned the capital structure item, you want to choose a ratio in the correct way. So here we can see that Magnet is valued on P. Here we have the P. And we have EV to EBITDA. We also have price to sales. This looks at its value at various different stages of the income statement and tell you what's going on. All of these will be forward multiples because the idea is that a company trades on its estimated data rather than fundamental data. And you can see that Magnet is valued at 25.77 times next year's earnings. Okay? The average is 19.52, so it's overvalued in theory. Okay? Based on the second year's earnings, you can see it gets a lot cheaper, but it's still highly above average. If we sort by second year earnings, you'll also see that it's the most overvalued based on 2-year forward earnings. Okay? Now, what you'll also see, just to make it a bit easier, is in the top right-hand corner, a table of metrics. So that includes price earnings, return on equity can also be a way of measuring it, but you wouldn't really use it as a valuation multiple. That can make it easier to see whether a peer is undervalued, or over or underperforming for a sector. All of these things, again, you can output to Excel to do this analysis yourself. Really, what you have to decide is two things. Just the companies that you want to put in and the values that you want to get out. And if you want to make those changes to see the values that you want to get out, so equity valuation is good, but also CDS is a bad example, but you might want to do things like operating statistics. How is their growth? How is various different other measures? That is more of a trial and error process. It really is. It sounds disappointing perhaps, but it's as I say, an art as opposed to a science. Now, this is relative valuation in a basic sense. One thing that you can do to make it a bit more interesting, I should have shown before, is graphing, so you can make it a little bit more visual. If you right-click, you've got a graph column. It will let you see here. It looks like, should load up in a second, or not. The alternative way is to run GX. X is for cross-sectional. We'll see if it works this time. There you go. You get a nicer view. This will show you whether or not a company, which end of the scale the company sits on. I have a pre-canned one. So here, for example, I've just loaded one where on the top of the screen I compare the forward PE. In the bottom I compare EV to EBITDA. So on the left-hand side you can see this Sonae. This is a Portuguese food retailer. Yeah. In price earnings terms, it's trading at 22.5 times its earnings. If I look at its EV to EBITDA, it's only at 6.5 times. So there's something important about the capital structure that you might need to consider in terms of whether or not it's an expensive or cheap stock. Okay? That's the sort of thing that is important to look at. This visualization makes it easier to find outliers than just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet, which is quite a difficult approach. Now, to make this more useful and more interesting over time, we have one other function, and that is EQRV. Here, if I click on EQRV, you'll see it's going to calculate for me a couple of things. It's going to calculate the premium that you pay for the stock. So the premium is how different the multiple is from its peer companies. So you can see that if we take price earnings, we already saw that Magnique was trading at, that's not useful, it was at 21 times. I'll just say the numbers rather than highlight. The rest of the peers are trading at 16.5 times. So it's 30% more expensive than its peer companies. That sounds bad. That sounds like, you know what, it's probably a good time to sell it. Maybe if you're looking to buy it, it's not great. Things along those lines. But how do you know that's not actually the normal status for the company? Well, you have to look at the average and compare it to how it's traded over time. This function, EQRV, will let you do that, because what it will do is it will say, okay, that's the current premium, current percentage difference between the two numbers. What's the average over the past 2 years? 32%. You know what? On that basis, it's actually fair value. Like, if you want to make a position in it, yeah, it's okay. It's not so bad. You might want to think about other factors involved in there, but it's pretty good. Here you'll see an example based on EV for sales. It's actually expensive. So you can see that it's 150 times the rest of the peers. In general, it trades at 72 times. So that is not a good sign. That suggests it's quite expensive. If I were to take, this is where Gazprom becomes a useful example, one that is always cheap. Bloomberg has decided to get slow. If I take Gazprom, then we will see some green on the page, I think, as it tells us that it's very cheap. Here we go. So you can see that Gazprom is trading at a massive discount, 65% less than the relative companies. It's always traded at a discount anyway, but now it's particularly cheap. So that's an interesting perspective on what's happening in the stock. You can click on any of the numbers as well and see what changes it. So you can see if there's here, here's not a good example. The things that have changed, Vodafone is a very good example. Sorry to use a UK stock, but there's lots of events that happen in Vodafone's past 12 months that make it interesting. Here you can see Vodafone is very expensive. The reason for this is because of all of the problems with Verizon. They've been doing lots of mergers, well, the whole merger collapsing and so on and so forth. You can see if there are any events that drive it. Now, what we've got at the top is Vodafone's multiple, and then we've got the average multiple. You can see Vodafone's multiple continues to go up, whilst the peers stay constant. What's causing it? Well, there's a big jump here when they released earnings. There are big jumps here, and all those spikes that you see at the end are coming out of the fact that it says there Verizon in talks with Vodafone for full control of wireless. When that news came out, the share price moved massively, and that caused it to be relatively more expensive. Okay? So these sorts of analysis can be quite interesting, and really just looking at lots of historical data and doing various relative comparisons. to give you an idea of the company's worth. So that's kind of from an absolute perspective, looking at DCFs and free cash flow models, through to relative valuation, a basic idea of what you can do. Okay? Hopefully with a little bit of Bloomberg data inside there. I think probably Excel is a topic we can touch on another time. I think for time reasons, I'll just give a very basic introduction to what you can do with comparable transaction valuation. So as we've seen with relative valuation, you can use other stocks to decide how much a company should be worth. You work out its EV/EBITDA and then decide, okay, I now know that the company is should be valued at 15 times, and therefore I know its price. Well, if you want to do the same for a company that is private, you can do the same thing again. But you don't really have it, you don't necessarily use publicly traded companies because you might not know enough data about that company. So what can you do? You can use historical deal prices. So what people have paid to either buy or acquire companies, what people have paid to take companies private, and so on and so forth. And we have a whole database